next teller is someone that I know very well. She's my wife. And most of you know her. I am not going to try to give her the introduction that I'd love to give her because I want her to be able to get on stage and be composed to tell her story. But I can tell you that I met her 9 years ago, almost to the day, when she walked into Joe's wearing a green dress on St. Patrick's Day in 2006 and applied for a job. And she almost didn't get hired. And I can't believe how different my life would have been if she didn't. And I'm so grateful that it happened. So I'm not going to go any further than give the standard bio introduction, and I'm going to let her steal the show. Christiana Herbert has been a creative for as long as she can remember, and she's a lifelong crusader for social justice. She staged her first environmental protest at age 8 when her parents cut down a tree. Right? Truth. With a background in performance and modeling industry, she's excited to start telling stories on a regular basis. She maintains that childlike sense of wonderment and delight is the key to maintaining happiness, and therefore refuses to apologize for her minion obsession. Please welcome to the stage my wife, Christiana Herbert.
Well, thank you. Well, tonight I'm actually going to talk about fear. I think fear is rational. Fear is a rational, evolutionary response to external stimulus that, it makes sense. When our ancestors felt fear, it made sense. They knew that if a saber-toothed tiger was looking you in the eye and it looked kind of hungry, fear was the rational response. Fear told you to get the heck out of there, lest you become somebody's dinner. Well, these days in Chicago, I don't think we see too many saber-toothed tigers. In fact, the only tigers I've ever seen are at the zoo, behind cages, where they can't get me. Despite all that, I deal with fear a lot. I deal with fear on a regular basis. I think everybody does. There's a whole bunch of them. There's the fear of heights, and fear of deep water, fear of sharks, fear of death, fear of public speaking, which a lot of people rate above death as their greatest fear. The interesting thing is that as a child, I was relatively fearless. I jumped out of trees, I jumped off of swing sets, I jumped in the deep end of the pool, I did a lot of jumping. And I didn't think about whether or not I was going to hit the ground running. I did. And it was only as an adult where fear really began to creep in, and I found myself just over a decade ago, kind of looking down over the edge of something and feeling for the first time this gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach that said, don't look down there, get back up, get away. And I ended up with this fear of deep water, which is kind of irrational when you grow up in Chicago and don't spend that much time at the lake. I remember our very first snorkeling expedition, where I nearly drowned my husband, because I was so miserable and so nervous that I was clinging onto his shoulder and pushing him under the water, and that nearly ended very poorly. So despite these fears, I nonetheless, in 2013, jumped off a cliff into the ocean, a very tall cliff, might I add, and I also got certified to scuba dive. So you might be wondering, well, how on earth did that happen? And the reason is that I had finally experienced things that pushed me completely out of my comfort zone and made me feel like I could take on anything. So, some of you who are here tonight were actually at my wedding, which was a pretty fantastic time. It was a magical and wonderful day, and I was lucky enough to plan the whole thing myself and have it go pretty much according to plan the whole way through. So I had this, whole vision of how it was going to go, which was kind of remarkable because I was never the little girl who cut out pictures and put them on a, poster board and thought about my wedding. I was just not that kind of girl. But nonetheless, I had this vision of a long lace gown and vintage books on all the tables, just because I like books, and wildflowers, and my bridesmaids all wearing emerald green, and the groomsmen in gray, escorting them down the aisle, and traditional Irish music. And most importantly, what really mattered to me was that everybody who attended the wedding to be so excited for us that they were jumping up and down with joy. I had that picture in my head. So, everything went according to plan. We found a fantastic venue that was going to allow us to do basically whatever we wanted, and it was large enough that everybody could stay with us for the whole weekend. And we even picked a date that worked with my childhood friend who flew in from Ireland to take our photos. So everything went great. And then, a week before the wedding, I got a phone call that would change my life forever after. It was Friday, it was evening, and I was busily working on assembling wedding favors, standing at the counter, and Jim had just left to go to Wildfire to pick up a carry-out order for our dinner. And I got a phone call, and it was my mother, and I looked at the phone, and I immediately just had this terrible feeling. Didn't really know where it had come from. Usually phone calls from my mother are not met with such apprehension. But I picked up the phone and was nonetheless immediately, my suspicions were confirmed, and I could tell that she had been crying. And she told me that my grandmother, my beloved grandmother, who was the matriarch of our family, and my very last grandparent who was going to attend the wedding, had collapsed. She had collapsed at home that day and was rushed to the hospital, and she was on life support, and she was in a coma, and nobody knew if she was going to make it. But what we did know was that she was not going to be at my wedding. And it took just that split second for me to realize that she was not coming back. I knew for sure that she was not coming back. I knew that she would be presented a choice, and she would have to make a choice, whether or not to come back to her broken body and live whatever life she had left, or cross over. And I knew what her choice was going to be. So the next few days passed in a blur. There were still things that had to get done. There were still checklists that had to be checked off. I was getting married in a week. So we hurriedly worked and just kept our noses to the grindstone, all the while wondering whether or not Grandma was going to wake up. Eventually it came to be Tuesday, and it was Tuesday, just a few days before my Saturday wedding. And Jim and I got in the car, drove 3 hours downstate while I hurriedly assembled wedding programs on my lap, and we went there to pay our last respects and say goodbye. Everyone else had still held out some hope that she might wake up, but once we got there, everybody knew. It was done. And the whole family was there. We made the only reasonable, rational, and kind decision that there was left to be made, and we decided to remove life support. We did that, and she continued breathing, and we all waited for as long as we possibly could, and then eventually we all had to go our separate ways, and Jim and I drove the next 3 hours all the way back to the city, and we got home, and Jim collapsed into bed. I began hurriedly catching up on all of the things I needed to do that I hadn't been able to do because I wasn't at home all day. And I worked and worked and worked into the night. And somewhere around 4 a.m., I felt my grandmother nudge me and tell me to go to bed. And I thought I was basically delirious at that point in time. I didn't think that I had anything left in me, so I said, oh, all right, fine. I'm going to bed, point taken. I did. Went to bed, and I fell into one of the more restful sleeps that I had had in weeks, certainly since that phone call. I was awoken several hours later by another phone call from my mom, who told me that my grandma had indeed passed. She was gone, and she had passed right around 4 a.m. that morning. Whatever grief I felt at that time, I didn't have time for it. So I just took it off like a jacket, hung it on the wall, and said, I'll get to you later. I've got stuff to do. I'm getting married in 3 days. So we kept going. Jim and I picked up a car, picked up all the wine for the weekend, packed up all of our stuff, drove all the way out to the venue and began the process of setting things up for a wedding venue where nothing is set up, where you rent everything that you want for your event. So we set up all of our tables and chairs, and we had a lot of help, and thank goodness for that. The day before the wedding was tense. Everybody knew what had happened. Everybody was being very kind, but there was this pressure, like, let's get things done on top of everything else. And I spent all day with the caterer and my coordinator, walking around, setting things up, trying to show them exactly what I had in my mind's eye, what I wanted things to look at. I did manage to squeeze in a manicure and pedicure. Recommended. And then I had to get ready. We got ready for the rehearsal, and everyone was super nervous because we knew it was going to rain. And we figured, okay, let's quickly squeeze in this rehearsal outdoors before it starts to rain, and then we'll hurry up and come inside, and then we're in for the night, and everything's done. So we did just that. We went outside, and it started to rain. We had just barely begun the rehearsal, and it started to rain. So we walked down the hill and decided, let's just practice. You know, we'll still be outside, but let's practice in this tent. This tent that lived on the property that was very old and had 4 walls all around it that I hated so much that I insisted on having a different tent of my own for the actual celebration. So we're like, okay, this one's covered, it's got walls, there's nothing in it, let's practice in here. And we began, and the noise of the rain, I'll never forget, was deafening, falling on the ceiling, falling on the walls, and we began our rehearsal, and everybody walked down the aisle, and it was just time for my father and I to practice walking down the aisle, and we were arm in arm, and I had put my cell phone behind me somewhere, and the lights began to flicker in the tent, and I glanced to the left, just in time to see daylight in between the bottom of the tent and the ground, and it was then that I realized that the winds had picked up to the extent that the tent was actually being lifted out of the ground and going sideways. And the flickering I saw wasn't just romantic flickering, it was the flickering of wires being pulled out of the ground and ripped to shreds in the middle of the rain above our heads. And I realized all of this just in the split second before everyone began to scream and run out of the tent into the pouring rain. I ran out with them, and then promptly realized I had forgotten my phone, ran back inside, grabbed my phone, ran back out, just in time to look at my beautiful wedding tent with all of the tables set and all the linens and places fully set for the next day, and I saw the wind picking things up and throwing it, and I could hear the sound of breaking glass. And I did what any reasonable and rational person would do, who had just lost their grandmother 3 days previously and was watching their wedding be summarily demolished right in front of them. I went absolutely hysterical. I have never been hysterical in my life. I hope to never be there again. But I started crying, and this was not the pretty tears that you see in the movies. It was ugly crying. I lost it, and my legs stopped working. They just stopped working, and I was about to just collapse, but luckily Jim was there, and my middle sister Carrie, and they grabbed me one on each side by the elbows and dragged me, sopping wet, makeup running down to my chin, with a sandal sideways and hanging off my ankle, up the hill to the house through the grass. This is only now becoming humorous to me. Well, we got lucky. We had really, really good people on our side and great vendors, and everybody came out that night and set things back up and worked all the next day up until we said I do, getting things set up. And my Humpty Dumpty wedding did get put back together again, and we did have this magical day. We had, you know, the vintage books and the flowers and the bridesmaids in green and the gentlemen in gray, and I had my long lace dress, and most importantly, I had my husband, and people were so happy and so excited to be there that they were jumping up and down with joy, you know, to usher us into this new adventure, this new commitment that we were making. So, I ask you, after living through all of those things, what on earth about heights or deep water was really going to be intimidating to me? I got to my honeymoon and I was invincible. I have never been so fearless in my life. I was convinced that nothing could touch me. I was convinced that I would never die. I was made of titanium. So when the opportunity presented itself to jump off a 50-foot cliff into the ocean, I did. I nearly lost my bathing suit in the process. But I did it. I did it. And I later found out that people have died jumping from that spot. I will probably never do it again. wanted to learn to scuba dive. Deep water, I'll be fine. I had to complete a swimming test and swim more laps in succession of the resort pool than I had ever swum in succession in my life. And I barely made it. I almost drowned. But I was determined. I was bound and determined to finish it, and the instructor took pity on me. And even though he was smirking and really kind of amused at my feeble attempts to just keep going back and forth, I did it. And I was the last one out of the pool. My legs were rubber, and I nearly threw up, but I did it. And I completed my training, and I scuba dived. I went on 4 different dives, and I discovered a whole new world under the sea, and my 8-year-old dreams of becoming the Little Mermaid were realized, and I was a very happy lady. So, of course, the big question now is, well, Christiana, are you still afraid of heights? Are you still afraid of deep water? And the answer is yes, I'm still afraid. But what I've learned is that we've got a choice that we can make here. You can either choose to control your fear, or you can let those fears control you. And by pushing out of my comfort zone and being forced to confront my fears, I realized that, my fears really weren't as scary as I thought they were when I faced them. And that for me, at least in the absence of saber-toothed tigers, there's very little that's worth being afraid about. Thank you.